Hello, everyone. Big War Weekend welcome for everyone here today. Thank you for coming. Ladies and gentlemen of the Warwick County Historical Society, thank you all for making the effort to attend our meetings in the middle of the day on a Wednesday. I mean, wow, we appreciate that. I'm sure we all have something better we could be doing. Maybe not. But it's nice that you guys come out to Old Denby and meet, about an old, obsolete county, not here anymore, mostly forgotten. We all know that, before anything happened here with the English, there's a long history of this area, this land. There was people here before and all that. We kind of forget that. We stuck in the 400-year thing. Today we get to hear about Warwick militia commanders and such, and this is a very welcome topic, especially in this 250th year. Our county bore devastating loss of its deeds and writs and judgments and disputes when the federal forces just ran off with them in April of 1862. I say ran off, etc. Included in these documents were several that bore signatures of the agents of George III. What treasures we, but especially us here, lost. All those records are gone. We're Burnham County. We deal with it. We have to. But we barely have any real history of Warwick from the time period he's talking about today. Really it comes down to we don't even know their names, a lot of times. We have a tree in the parking lot out here that we planted in 2013, a coast live oak in the middle of the parking lot out there. That has flourished. It's done very well. In 2013 we brought it in as a stick. We had it in here, just as a stick. And the thing is huge out there now. Every little leaf on that tree represents, to me at least, one lost Warwickian, one lost name. We don't know who they are anymore. They're just gone. So that's a significant tree out there. It's not just a tree. Anyway, we have some copies. We barely have any history, except for what was recorded in other counties, copies that were sent to England, scarce return of a small number. We had family, the man passed on in Massachusetts. His family went through the documents and we got 647 of the original Warwick County documents back here, which were, they're very, very precious to us now. We don't actually have the document, we have digital copies of it. We're not allowed to have them. All right, but some of those had the flourishing signatures of Miles Carey and all that. Those times seem gone now. So we have those little documents, but what about the rest of the body of their work and the ones before him? Barely, except for a relatively small number, we don't know their names. Lost to time, lost to family memory, forgotten, erased. Anyway, that's where we sit at the Warwick County Historical Society. We work with what we have. Today we will learn of some of our ancestors. Possibly, maybe they were the wiliest of all of them. We'll have to see. The society as an entity is doing just fine, financially and otherwise. We are participating in a grant with our Mulberry Island archaeology friends. We're going to put a new pathway in at the Matthew Jones house, because on the Twins back. We survived the computer switchover to Windows 11. Sharon continues to preserve old Warwick County records in the courthouse. I helped occasionally. We have multiple small projects going on. Of course, you guys are all welcome to come visit the 1810, our little ancient headquarters over there. We can always use volunteer help, of course. We have a new quarterly coming out, a new newsletter in July with a very impressive article from Don Worsham, very impressive. We will all learn something from that. I'm not sure I'll have it ready for July because we're taking off to Alaska to go see my grandchildren, my daughter in Alaska. So that's a big trip coming up. We have a member, Connor DeWall, who's a younger kid, speaking up on the lack of archaeological phase studies at the new development sites by Enview and all that. I think they've done phase 1 and not 2 or 3 on any of that, but they're going to put houses on it, of course. So if you guys would like to support him, I think he had a petition going around or something, but he's not here today. So I got an email from Fresno, California, from a nice lady whose ancestors traced back to Jamestown. The last name was Maddox. in her email, she said she did not know much about, but she'd heard that he was buried at Warwick Squeak. The Warwick Squeak, come on. And I figured it out, Morris Quayock. I referred her to Isle of Wight County. she was happy to find out she's calling it Warwick Squeak, so, okay. And it reminded me of another lady I talked to for weeks on email, back and forth, and just in total confusion, and I figured out she's talking about Warwick, England. She's not talking about here. So that was fun. All right, so one other thing was they're tearing down a building at the Naval Weapons Station, building 704. It's on the Newport News side, and of course they send the historical societies the information about that. Building 704. Does anyone have any real attachment to Building 704 at Naval Weapons Station? It was an old barracks or something like that. There. I'm going to tell them to tear it down. Okay. All right. So, any other society business from the floor? Anybody have an announcement? You think? Here she comes. I'm going to let you introduce the speaker too. So, yeah. Thank you.
A couple more pieces of business. Anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Mary Selchuk. With the Lloyd County Historical Society and also Newport News Historic Services. I think most of you have had the opportunity to sign the Get Well card that we have for Janet Raines, one of our members who broke her right hand and ankle last week. And if you wish to visit her, she's in Riverside Rehab out of 17 across from the big Walmart. Also, while we're speaking about Warwick Squeak or Warwick or Isle of Wight County, next month's program on Wednesday, July 21, will be brought to us by the director of the Isle of Wight County Museum, Jennifer England, and the subject is pine trees. And this is one of our VA 250 events. This specifically, she will be talking about the ways that pine trees were useful during the American Revolution to our patriots. We also, following up, segueing on what Darcy said about VA 250 and the Library of Virginia. I've just recently been in touch with someone there, and we will be bringing you another LVA speaker next year who will be using Warwick documents to tell us in more detail some of the activities that happened here during the Rep War. But today, it is my pleasure, and I'm so glad to see such a nice turnout, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sean, and he's actually, on his remarks, he told me how to pronounce his name. However, it's different from how his wife told me to pronounce the name. So she would like to be known as Heuvel. Is that correct? Heuvel. Heuvel, okay, and he would like to be known as Heuvel. So I'm just going to call him Sean. Anyway, Dr. Sean. He is a higher educational professional. He served in both faculty and administrative roles. He's currently employed at Christopher Newport University, where he serves as the Associate Dean of Graduate and Professional Programs. And you've been there a long time, Sean.
23 years.
Okay, you're getting there. You're getting along there. He is a military historian by trade, and he specializes in the American Revolution. He holds an MA from the University of Richmond, and a BA, an MED, and a PhD from the College of William and Mary. Pretty impressive there, Sean. He's also an active member of the Society of Cincinnati and the Sons of the American Revolution. He serves as Vice President on the Board of Directors of the Virginia War Museum Foundation. He and his family, of which many of them are here with us today, live in Williamsburg. Thank you for coming. Sean is the author or the editor of several books. One of them was Life After Jeb Stuart, the memoirs of his granddaughter, Morrow Stuart Smith. Some of you may remember, about 10 years ago, we had a program. We were gathered in Robinson Bruton Park to dedicate and hear about the family that had lived on that area, which was then known as Oakland Plantation. So thanks to Sean, that it was his work and his research that permitted us to be able to put together those interpretive panels. And he's back again today. But a couple other books he has, he's written one on the College of William and Mary in the Civil War. I want you to know that today, though, his publication is going to focus on the Revolutionary War. And it's called The Revolutionary War Memoirs of Major General William Heath. And his latest tome is Virginia Militia Commanders of 1781 at the Siege of Yorktown. So this is going to be a lot of new material for us, Sean. So we are all eager. We are history sponges. We want to hear everything you have to tell us. So take it away, Sean. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mary, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm excited to have this big turnout. This is great. Grateful to my parents and then my wife, Katie, and kids, SJ and Emma, for they've heard this before, by the way, so this is really noble of them to sit through this again. And then a lot of my pals from the Virginia War Museum Foundation Board. We've got Ken, Christy, Ann, John. John is wearing two hats as a fellow pal from Christopher Newport University, where he's one of our distinguished history professors, and so glad to have a lot of friends here. We've got a mom of a CNU alumna with Sharon, so another old pal. So thank you all for coming. And this topic, which I'll get into in a minute, is just really representative of what Darcy was talking about, and that in this part of the world, as much as we know about the Revolutionary War, there's a whole lot we don't know. And in the presentation, we'll discuss some of the reasons for that. But the story of, for instance, Warwick County in the American Revolution, that's also a topic that fascinates me. And I was telling someone that in this kind of larger scheme of things, it's like trying to put together a 1,000-piece puzzle and you have about 285 pieces. Because, again, for various reasons, there's just a void of information. And then, so we know some of the people, like Darcy mentioned, Miles Wilson Carey and Cole Diggs, and some of the luminaries that were in this part of the world during the Revolution. And some of their names figure into this story that I'm about to tell, too. So, with all that being said, let's dive in. So, Sons of the Old Dominion, Virginia Militia Commanders at the 1781 Siege of Yorktown. So we had the Civil War one, too, a little bit later, in 1862, but we'll do that one another time. So, going back to what I was talking about a second ago, a lot has been written about the Siege of Yorktown in particular, about many facets of it. If you look at, for instance, the Continental Army order of battle, who was there, the Alexander Hamiltons and the like, there's a lot of information because there's a lot of primary source data to support what we know about those forces being there. If we look at the composition of the British forces, if we look at the composition of the French forces, Army and Navy, they've kept pretty good records, so we know a lot. But one thing that I kind of stumbled into as a topic here was to discover that when we look at the Virginia militia, so that was a sizable chunk of the forces of the Allied Army that were at Yorktown. We're talking about 4,000 people or so. We know very little. There's just sort of a vacuum on that topic. And again, there are various reasons for it, but we'll get into that. So I'll talk about my own journey, how I got into this whole thing in a minute. But what this presentation seeks to do is just give you kind of a sneak preview of my book. And what I tried to do in my book was explore, on one level, what was the Virginia militia doing at Yorktown? What roles were they filling? But also, who was leading them? Because again, there's very little information out there. And to the point where I was shocked. I was honestly shocked that there's just, how can we not know this? But there are reasons why. And so this presentation, in the form of the book that I wrote, kind of explores, along with talking about what the militia forces were doing at Yorktown, who was leading them, what were their stories. And everyone who was at this siege has an important story to tell. All 4,000 of the militia forces and the rest of the people who were there. But this is sort of my attempt to start the conversation of at least, let's talk about, okay, some of the commanding officers. Let's just try to get a read on who these people were. And then maybe with future research, we can learn more and more and get into the everyday soldiers and the people who supported them as well. So I was really excited to get this image to utilize as the cover of the book, and his depiction of the surrender at Yorktown by Keith Rocco. And he painted this and he donated it to the National Park Service, also conveying the copyright to the National Park Service, so going to the public domain. So I was able to, after triple, quadruple checking, like use it as a cover of the book without getting sued. That's always a good thing. John can commiserate because he's written quite a few books himself. So we'll talk about what was my personal connection with getting into this whole topic. And then we'll talk about the contextual overview. Again, what were the Virginia militia commanders and forces and personnel doing at Yorktown? What was their role in their fight against the British? Then we'll get to the heart of what I tried to do in this book, which was sort of recreate the order of battle for the Virginia militia forces. So what regiments were there, from what areas, who were their commanding officers, and list all of that. And also talk about some biographical portraits, so some of the interesting people that I came across in this journey who were at Yorktown, but also talk about, in the wider scheme of things, some of the interesting journeys I had in writing the book. So there were kind of some fun experiences and things that happened along the way. And then we'll do some questions and answers, so how's that? All right. So my journey with this topic started with, as a lot of you can relate, family history research, genealogy, right? And I was exploring a pair, this was a few years ago, of 6th grade granduncles of mine. So George Roush and Jonas Roush, both sons of a German immigrant. They lived in Shenandoah County, and they served in the Shenandoah County militia during the siege at Yorktown. And I discovered that, and I thought, well, that's really, really cool, you know, because especially being from this area, wow, that's a local connection, and my relatives may have been there and walking around, and I wanted to learn all the things about them, right? And this is a rendering of George Roush, by the way. I have to mention on a side note, it kind of low-key creeps me out a little bit to see this, because it kind of looks like my great-grandmother. Mom, does it look like Granny? Yeah, so it's like, wow, she kind of like this. Wow, right? So there's a little bit of family resemblance there. But that's through my great-grandmother, that lineage that goes back to this individual. And so he was at Yorktown, as was his brother. And like I said, I wanted to try to learn more about what they were doing during the siege. And as all historians do, I started combing primary sources, secondary sources, and as much as I tried, it was just hard to find information. There just really wasn't much there. And I remember going to one of the chief historians at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown, this was several years ago, and asking this question. I said, so I'm trying to figure out even who commanded the regiment this guy was in. I couldn't even figure that out. And I said, where is the information? How can we find this out? And he honestly just shrugged his shoulders and said, it just isn't there. We don't know. And so that got me on my journey to try to figure out how to put at least part of this puzzle together. I can't put the whole puzzle together, but maybe I can put a part of it together to figure out, okay, what regiments of Virginia militia were at Yorktown? Who was commanding them? What were the stories of these people? That sort of thing. So that's what got me on my way. But to give you some contextual overview, so if you look at the Allied Army that was at Yorktown, there were 3 components of it, right? You had the Continental Army, and by then, there weren't a lot of Virginians in those Continental Army regiments. Why do you think that is? Because earlier in the war, you had like the 1st Virginia Regiment, 2nd Virginia Regiment, Continental Line, 3rd Virginia Regiment, but not at Yorktown. Why was that?
Killed in action, killed.
Well, that's sort of right. Yeah. You ever heard of the Siege of Charleston? A lot of those units were captured following the Siege of Charleston, so the Virginia Continental Line just sort of disintegrated, and they were trying to reconstitute it. But by the time of the Siege of Yorktown, when you look at the Continental Army forces that were there, it was mainly regiments from like Massachusetts and New Jersey and places like that. And they were trying to get some Virginia representation, but most of the Virginians who were at Yorktown at the siege were on the militia side. So you had kind of a interesting composition of people that were in these militia regiments. So some of them had never seen action before. They were coming off of their home farm and for the first time going into a military theater of operation. Others were seasoned veterans. They had actually priorly served in the Continental Army, and they had been at battles like Heuvel Courthouse, and they were highly trained. And so it was sort of a mixture of all of those things, an experienced militia versus experienced ones. So leading up to Yorktown, most of the ones that experienced had been, like I said, in places like Heuvel Courthouse in Camden, and had seen action. And talking about what they were doing at the siege, that's a whole other interesting conversation. What do you think? What was the role the militia personnel played? How are they supporting the Continental Army? So you have the Continental Army, you got the French, and you got the militia. What were the militia people doing to support the siege?
Running away.
Gathering supplies.
Okay, gathering supplies. Yeah, right.
They did trenches.
Digging trenches, that was a big one. They were spent a lot of their time doing that. They were moving supplies. We're pretty close to Fort Eustis here. That was one of the big entry points for supplies that were then put on horse and carts and moved up to Yorktown. And there was militia facilitating that. They would guard prisoners following the siege. After the siege of Yorktown, you had thousands of British POWs, and they were marched to points north, to Northwest Virginia and to Maryland, Pennsylvania, and they were protected and guarded by militia forces. Militia forces also helped to operate the hospitals and do a wide variety of things. It's interesting because, we'll get into this a little later, but a lot of the militia did not see actual fighting, at least around Yorktown, but they did in Gloucester. We'll talk about that later. So some militia forces actually were in combat as well against the British, mainly British cavalry. So what do we know about these militia people up to now? We do know that this guy named Thomas Nelson, who was also governor of Virginia, doubled as a brigadier general and commanded the entire militia force of about 4,000 or so people. And then we know that, and if you look at any kind of and there's some good books on the siege of Yorktown, any secondary source, things that have been written about this, they'll also typically talk about the 3 militia brigades. And they were commanded by Edward Stevens, Robert Lawson, and George Wheaton. We'll talk more about those guys in a second. And those were all prior service Continental officers. But then the funny thing is, after that, it's kind of crickets. We just don't know. What about the regiments? Who was commanding them? And that sort of thing. We just don't know. There's just not a lot of good information. So that's where I was spending my time to try to reconstruct this story and this command structure and the like. So for Revolutionary War historians, and Darcy brought up a good point, primary sources are hard to find, right? Especially for Revolutionary War. And so, for reasons we'll discuss. I was actually talking to people about this earlier, what is probably the best place for us to go to find information these days in terms of possible sources to learn about Revolutionary War veterans and that sort of thing? Any guesses?
State library, pension records, national.
There you go, pension records. So, you think about it, a lot of these soldiers, in some cases they did if they were Continental line, but if they were militia, sometimes they didn't keep their service records. They didn't have anything. And really the best place to go to get information on this is pension records that were filed in the post-war era. So in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, these veterans as elderly men, by this point in time, they were filing applications to get funding from the federal government for their service during the Revolution. And one resource I would commend to you all is a website called Southern Campaigns of the American Revolution. That's the database I used for this project. And that's where a team of researchers has gone, and it's really been painstaking work. They've digitized thousands of pages of post-war pension application records and made it a keyword searchable database. So you can go in and search by a topic or by a person, and it really primarily is centered on individuals that served in the southern states during the Revolutionary War. But if you're lucky, you could find a pension application for, let's say, an ancestor. And sometimes, you know, some of it is more robust than others, but sometimes you can find a gold mine of data. I mean, it's just incredible material. So that's really where I went to get a lot of information for this book. So what I did was, you know, utilizing these post-war pension application records, I would do keyword searches. And I would try to figure out, okay, Yorktown and Edward Stevens, because he was one of the brigade commanders there. And then I would look up results, and I would look up the applications of individuals who said they served under him. And so if I had one veteran say, yeah, I served under Colonel William Dark at Yorktown, that's nice. But if I had 4 or 5 saying that, I knew Colonel William Dark was there. And amazingly, a lot of these officers were people I'd never heard of. And I mean, some of them were more common than others, but it was quite surprising to come across some of these individuals. So through that process of data triangulation, I came up with about 30 senior officers who had, you know, I can basically document were present at the siege. And one thing that makes this complicated is that my focus was who were the officers who were there during the actual dates of the siege of Yorktown. And so not so much officers who were there during the run-up to it. So what would happen is sometimes officers would lead troops from Shenandoah Valley area, and they would take them to Yorktown to basically kind of drop them off and go back, and then they would be absorbed into another regiment, that sort of thing. And so I, again, was really trying to concentrate just on the people who were there during the siege itself. But like I said, there were 3 brigades of Virginia militia at Yorktown. Edward Stevens commanded the first one. This one was at Yorktown, along the front at Yorktown. So if I'm trying to think of a good way to describe it, if you're heading toward the Coast Guard base, right outside the National Park Museum at Yorktown, you can kind of hook a right, and there's a road you can take that's sort of a private tour that you have to pay to do, a driving tour, to go to the different positions of the battlefield. The Virginia militia were situated sort of in that area. There's actually a marker that denotes where they were and that sort of thing. So General Stevens commanded about 750 troops. He had an interesting Rev War career, and so like the other 2, he was a Continental Army officer. He had risen up to becoming a colonel in the Continental Army, and very aggressive commander. And he was actually one of the people that talked Horatio Gates into fighting at the Battle of Camden, because there was the famous gathering around the fireside the night before the battle, and Gates was kind of questioning, I don't know if this is a good idea. And Stevens was one of those people who said, we got to fight, we're already here, let's do it. And we know how that turned out. And so Stevens was in a lot of ways on a journey of redemption after that, because he was absolutely humiliated at Camden. A lot of his forces ran away, and he was trying to restore his military reputation. And he did that in part at Guilford Courthouse, where he was wounded in the thigh. He also, interesting fact, he narrowly avoided escape in Charlottesville when Bannister, Tarleton, and a bunch of British cavalry went out there and did a raid. I mean, if it had been 10 minutes later, Stephen would have been captured. But he got out, he basically sort of hid and disguised himself in civilian clothes and got on an old donkey. And as the story goes, he was riding right past the British cavalry as they were riding into Charlottesville. No one recognized him, and he kind of had a smirk on his face afterwards, and he got away. So he was at Yorktown. He commanded, as far as I can tell, and I can document, 3 different regiments within his brigade. So commanded by these individuals, William Dark, more on him in a second, Thomas Merriweather. If you've heard of Lewis and Clark, of Lewis and Clark fame, Merriweather is connected to one of them, and Colonel Elias Edmonds, who was an artillery officer. So as you'll see with this asterisk, a lot of these militia officers had prior service in the Continental Army. So there are kind of 2 paths to becoming militia officers during this time, in terms of people who were here in particular. Some of them were seasoned community leaders. So they were the judges and you know, or the kind of the civic elite that ran their community, and they got commissions as officers to command militia. But then others had served in the Continental Army on the Continental Line, and accrued a lot of action that way. Why would it, you think, be desirable for a Continental Army officer to switch over to the militia? Because that happened a lot. Stay close to home, okay. And that's a fair point. Some of these people, they were taken very far away from their homes, and when you're talking about the notion of sacrifice involved with this, they're getting letters from their family, from their wife, saying, look, I literally can't feed our children. I need help. And these people, you know, they weren't getting paid regularly, and some of them, you know, they did their 2 years or 3 years on the Continental Line, and they just said, I can't do this anymore. Like, financially, I have to go back home and help my family. And service in the militia was an opportunity to continue serving the cause, but it was in a way where they could actually do so from home. Others, they switched over to the militia because they got hung up in disputes over promotions and squabbles like that and internal military army politics. But a lot of them did make that migration over to the Continental Army. So the 2nd Brigade at the siege, so in Yorktown itself, was commanded by a guy named Robert Lawson. And very interesting individual. So like Edward Stevens, he was commanding about 750 troops. They're both in the semicircle around, on at least the American side at Yorktown. And Lawson, he's one of these people where he kind of appears out of nowhere. We don't know a whole lot about his early life, and then we know a lot about what he did in the Revolution, and then he sort of disappears again. And there's a lot of myth and legend associated with him. He is from, whereas Edward Stevens was from, I think, like kind of the Fredericksburg-ish, Culpeper County area. Lawson was from Farmville, Prince Edward County. He was actually one of the founding trustees of Hampton Sydney College. And so he was a distinguished state legislator and did a lot politically. Kind of took the normal course of service during the Revolution in the Continental Army. He was colonel of a regiment. He had seen action in some of the major battles in the Northern Theater. And switched over to militia and you know, commanded his brigade at Yorktown. It's kind of interesting because after this, his later life is kind of sketchy. We don't know a lot about it. There's not a lot of good information. As far as we can tell, he moved with his family to Kentucky. And I think he had some domestic family issues, unfortunately. And there was talk that he suffered from alcoholism and that there were different problems, and it was unfortunate. And one thing that I didn't put in my book, but it's kind of a really intriguing story that came about General Lawson, is there was a letter it was written by Thomas Jefferson to somebody else, and I think it was the early 1790s, right? And during this time that General Lawson would have been in Kentucky, this family, before I think the family came back, and then he came back later. And in this letter, Jefferson said something to the effect of, hey, did you hear that rumor about how Lawson murdered his wife? I thought, well, wait a minute. That's interesting. Okay. Did you hear the rumor, basically, so many words, of Lawson murdered his wife out in Kentucky? And so I thought, well, holy cow, I need to look into this. And I'm not sure where that rumor started, and you know, in researching his family further, his wife outlived him, so it clearly was not the case that she was murdered, at least, you know, at that point by now. And I really could not substantiate anything about that, and some of Lawson's descendants have forcefully refuted that charge to say that's absurd, that's absolutely absurd, there's no way that happened. So I did not include it in the book, but I kind of added as an interesting nuance of the story, you know, when I chat about the book. But Lawson, he kind of fell upon hard times afterwards, and he returned to Richmond eventually, but was just sort of destitute, and he was taken care of by the Society of the Cincinnati's Virginia Society in his final years, of which he was a member. But at Yorktown, kind of rewinding back his earlier life, he commanded several regiments. We'll talk about some of these people in a moment. And again, a lot of prior Continental Army service. These, in a lot of ways, were very interesting people. So Henry Skipwith was a brother-in-law of Thomas Jefferson. Who would have thought? But it's very, this interconnected world of Virginia gentry where they all kind of knew each other and married into their families and that sort of thing. So again, Edward Stephen and Robert Lawson, they were commanding the 2 Yorktown-based militia brigades. And those were the ones that were basically, to your point, digging trenches. And they were doing logistical support for the Continental Army to free up Continental Army forces to continue the siege against the British. Now the 3rd Brigade commander is George Wheaton. And he was the only one who had been a brigadier general in the Continental Army as well. So he was the highest ranking person to be a Virginia militia officer at the siege. And he was over in Gloucester. So he commanded 1,500 troops in Gloucester at that time, so the largest militia force. And you can see that the list of regimental commanders who report to him is significantly longer because he's commanding more troops as a result. And there's a lot of interesting names here, and we'll talk about a couple in a second, but Wheaton was also a really interesting guy. So he, with his wife, owned a tavern in Fredericksburg. It had been in his wife's family, and when his father-in-law passed away, it conveyed to General Wheaton and his wife. So this tavern was apparently the place to be in Fredericksburg. It was like the Studio 54, whatever, of in that town. And all the notables would stop by there, and George Washington and all those people. And so he was a well-known person socially, and also as a civic leader prior to the Revolution. His troops called him Old Joe Gourd because he was known to bring rum with him to, increase the morale of the forces under his command. And so he was very generous in sharing spirits with his troops. And again, kind of like the other 2, Stevens and Lawson, did sort of the conventional way up in the Continental Army. He served in some of the, big battles in the Northern Theater. But he felt as time went on that he was sort of being typecast as an administrator. And so a lot of his role was it kind of evolved into being desk jobs, as we would maybe say today. And that didn't really sit well with him. Because a lot of these individuals, they had this sense of history that what they were doing was a consequence, and they wanted to be part of this. They wanted to do something distinguished, in their mind. And so that was one big reason why he had quit the Continental Army, because he felt like he just wasn't getting anywhere in that system. And so he, like so many others, went to the militia. And when he heard that there was something going on at Yorktown, he hightailed it down there. And interestingly enough, one of these colonels, James Innes, was actually supposed to command the forces at Gloucester of the Virginia militia. That was the plan. But George Wheaton got his friend the Marquis de Lafayette to write him a letter of recommendation to say, hey, can General Wheaton be the commanding officer? And so George Washington made that decision at the last second because the Marquis gave him a letter of recommendation on LinkedIn, and joking. And Wheaton got that command. And so he had the interesting situation of working with the French because General Washington was a little shaky about only having militia forces in Gloucester. And why do you think that would be? In certain cases, that could be. And then what else could happen? So we've got Lord Cornwallis. He's surrounded in Yorktown, right? He's trying to figure out where to go and what could be a way for him to go. Yeah. So General Washington, the Continental Army and Command, they were very concerned that the British would escape through Gloucester, that they would just, take boats one night across the York River and leave. And as Washington had done so many times in his earlier travels in the war. So they also attached a large French contingent in Gloucester. And so General Wheaton kind of had to work with those French forces, and that was interesting because they didn't really quite see eye to eye on things. And that context culminated in the Battle of the Hook. And so, it's, again, the British were actively trying to figure out how to get out of that area and break out. And so they fought a huge cavalry battle in Gloucester. And if you go to Gloucester and you're driving on Route 17, it used to be the battle site was thought to be off of Hook Road where the Hardys is. So that's where they all had lunch after the battle, right? Yeah. But then what modern day archaeology determined was the actual site of the battle was a little further up Route 17 by what's now Abington Elementary School. And so now there are commemorative markers there, and there's been archaeological fieldwork to confirm that's where the Battle of the Hook took place. So that's where General Whedon and his forces would have been in the thick of it, and they were actually the only militia forces that were in combat fighting the British. One other interesting person I'll point out, there's a Colonel Sir John Peyton. And when I first came across that name, I thought, well, who the heck is that? That's interesting. Why is there a Sir there? And this is an example of a prominent Gloucester civic leader, and he had an aristocratic British noble title, but yet he was a patriot, who was given a militia regiment, again by virtue of just being a senior civic leader. So he's one of the few people that on the American side would have had Sir in front of his British military. Those are the 3 brigades. And then I also came across some other units where I couldn't really associate them with a particular brigade commander, but they were Yorktown. So Reuben Lindsay, he was a next door neighbor of Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson knew like half of these people, which is crazy. Charles Dabney from Hanover County, he commanded basically the remnants of the Virginia Continental Line, what was left. That was Virginia state troops who were at the battle. And then William Lewis, poor William Lewis. So one of my other odysseys I had to take in doing this book was when you do this sort of research, the bane of your existence is coming across people that have very common sounding names, like John Smith. Because there could have been 48 John Smiths that were near Yorktown during that time, and which one was it? And so there were a few of these officers who I was profiling. William Lewis is one of them, where I really could not for the life of me figure out if I had the correct William Lewis, because the information is just not there to confirm it. With William Lewis, there was a father-son combination. And we know that when the Marquis de Lafayette visited Yorktown in, I think, 1824, there was a William Lewis there to greet him. And I can't tell if it was the original guy or if it was his son, because they're both named William Lewis. And so I had to take the, and I'll look at my friend John, who can commiserate, I had to take sort of the cowardly way out and with some of these entries say, well, it could have been this person or it could have been this person, I can't be sure, you know, so I'll leave it to the reader to determine what they want to determine out of it. So, you know, keep coming up with those unique names. That's a lot easier for us to work with in the history community to figure these things out. So a few interesting facts about the siege, then we'll get to some real quick biographical portraits and questions. Any William Mary alumni in here? William Mary folk? Yeah, so a lot of William Mary alums. That's understandable given that Yorktown was happening in fairly close proximity to the college, and that, you know, the college at that time was Virginia's, along with Kansas City, higher institution. So multiple William Mary alumni, close ties to the college. Several future governors of Virginia as well as Maryland that were in this group. And then the aforementioned Thomas Jefferson brother-in-law, Henry Skidmore. So again, kind of some neat people. If you look at this map, the Virginia militia forces were kind of like around here. You got the French on that side, you got the Continental Line on the first parallel, the first line, and then the militia back here. And then you also had militia forces at Gloucester Point, so they were kind of spread out. Now my favorite part, biographical portraits. I enjoyed learning about these people because, again, something that shocked me was being a Rev War historian who's been in this part of the world for quite a long time. I'd never heard of a lot of these people. This is the first time I'd come across the names. William Dark is my favorite because he's actually the individual who commanded my relative's regiment. So going back to George Roush and Jonas Roush at the beginning of my talk, he commanded the regiment. And William Dark was a very interesting guy. Born in Philadelphia, he had served the French and Indian War. He was a captain in the 8th Virginia Regiment, Continental Line, which was one of the real famous Virginia regiments. And he even captured Germantown and was a POW for at least a couple of years. And following that, it's interesting, he retained his Continental Army Officers Commission, but he moved over to the militia. And And so by the time of the siege of Yorktown, and you can imagine, the war had not been in our part of the world since 1775-ish, 1776, right? And so all of a sudden, the British are coming in 1780, 1781, and Thomas Jefferson as governor is scrambling to try to raise militia regiments. So a lot of the stuff's being formed fast and furious, and Dark was one of these people that was thrown in the mix as a regimental colonel. So the funny story about him is he commanded the Hampshire and Berkeley Regiment. And all these regiments, by the way, would come in through Williamsburg, right? And the French and American Army were kind of using that as a staging area before they marched on to Yorktown to begin the siege. And so there was a period of time where Dark was with his unit in Williamsburg. They're waiting for stuff to get rolling. And George Washington and his entourage showed up, to sort of ready to take command there and get the process going. Well, William Dark is a colonel of the Virginia Militia Regiment, and all of a sudden, you've got General Washington show up, and he's got his aides and his whole entourage. This is, His Excellency, right? This is the big dog. And, he's greeting some of the local dignitaries, and who comes up all of a sudden but William Dark to basically give George Washington a big bear hug. They had known each other prior to the war, by the way, but as it's accounted, Washington's staff officers were mortified. They had never seen this happen before, and by the way, William Dark, he could care less. That was just him, and he was just, I think, looking to his old friend, and also someone who helped free him from captivity, and so, Washington got that warm welcome from Colonel Dark at Williamsburg before they went to Yorktown. So, this is a favorite painting of mine. It's really hard to find original portraits of these individuals. There are only a few examples, and this is probably one of the better ones for our Virginia militia officers who were at Yorktown. It's owned by the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. Another interesting individual is Thomas Matthews. And this is another one, I had never heard of this guy in my life until I worked on this project, and it's just shocking. But another individual who was present at the siege, I think it may have been in more of a staff capacity. I don't know if he was commanding an actual regiment, but according to veteran accounts, he was there, he was on site. And kind of like Alexander Hamilton, he was born in the West Indies. He immigrated to Norfolk, Virginia in the 1760s and became a really prominent lawyer, very distinguished attorney in that part of the world. During the war, he kind of straddled serving as a Continental Line officer as well as a militia officer, and went on to become 7th Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates. I have been to Matthews County up the road across the river any number of times. I had no idea that it was named after him until I did this project. But Matthews was named after him in 1791. I don't think Colonel Matthews he never went to Matthews County, but it was named in his honor. But one of my favorite stories from this, this is where my wife and my son are growing. They've heard this 85 times, and sorry. I got a fresh audience. I got to tell the story. But again, I was really trying to find original portraits of these people that could be included in the book. So to get away from kind of the run of the ordinary Library of Congress stock images to like really unique things that really make the book pop. And I heard rumors that there was a portrait of Colonel Matthews in Matthews County somewhere. And so I happened to go up there one day for a work-related meeting. And when I finished that up, I went to the Matthews County Visitor Center to make some inquiries. Because last I had read, it was maybe in that building somewhere. So I talked to the lady who was there, and she said, "Oh, well, I know what you're talking about, but it's not in this building. You need to talk to Miss Betty." And I said, "Who's Miss Betty?" And I was told that she is the local librarian of Matthews County, but also doubles as the informal mayor of Matthews. So basically, he's lady in charge of the town. And so she said, "You gotta go talk to Miss Betty because she's in charge of all this stuff." So I make my way to the library and walk in the door. And by the way, their staff could not have been nicer to me because I said, "Hey, I'm interested in studying Virginia Militia Commanders of Yorktown, and P.S. Thomas Matthews was there. They got every folder they could find out for me, and they went out of the special collections room and went to town. I had never seen that much documentation on a guy, Thomas Matthews, in my life, but just absolutely delightful and helpful. And so I get to meet Miss Betty, who was, and I say this with all fondness and respect, a very petite lady who's later in her years, but clearly in charge of that town. You don't mess with this day. And I explained what I was trying to do, and she said, well, let me make a couple phone calls. And she went back to her office, and she came out a little short time later and said, Don, we got people to come pick you up in 5 minutes, take you to the courthouse. I said, wow, okay, so that's, Miss Betty worked her magic. So, long way of saying that this portrait was actually in the new courthouse building in Matthews, but just one of these kind of gems that I think, this isn't the one, but a variant of it was painted by a descendant of his that just goes unnoticed, you know, and so he's figuring prominently in the book, but again, just another example of a local person with a rich Rev story that we just kind of forgot about. So hopefully the goal of this book is to kind of bring these stories back to life. John Francis Mercer, real quick, he's kind of getting into the realm of maybe a little bit better known individuals. Read the law under Thomas Jefferson and William Mary. One really interesting thing about him was during the earlier parts of the war, he was lieutenant in the 3rd Virginia Regiment, Continental Line. And he was an aide-de-camp to Charles Lee. Anyone heard of Charles Lee? Okay, what's Charles Lee famous for?
I don't remember. Heard of him, the House of Delegates. Bill of Rights.
That's A. Lee, yeah. This is the Continental Army General, Charles Lee. Yeah. Where is he?
He didn't follow Washington's orders.
Yeah, he and Washington didn't get along too well. Charles Lee had been an officer in the British Army prior to the Revolution, and he kind of felt that he should have gotten the senior command, and went to Washington said that didn't start the relationship out well. And at the Battle of Monmouth, they had an incident, and Lee was supposed to command forces, and it went all sideways. And if you listen to the myth and legend, when Washington came across Lee and encountered him in what would have been a very winnable battle, and again, if you listen to the myth and legend, I don't know if it's true, but Washington invented curse words that day to cuss this guy out and fire him on the spot. Well, Mercer was a Lee loyalist. He was his aide-de-camp, and he went down in flames with him. He said, this is absurd. I don't think what is being done generally is right. And he quit the Continental Army right there. And so Lee, who was a very interesting kind of quirky guy in his own right, never forgot that. He was just one of the few people that remained loyal to him, and I think he even remembered Mercer in his will. I mean, so that was the bond that they created and forged. Mercer, it's interesting, he married into a Maryland family, so after the war, he became a Maryland politician and governor of Maryland. So he was one person who kind of got out of Virginia and went to other places. So George Tucker, he's probably, of the Virginia initial officers, probably the, I'll get the questions soon, I don't want to keep going all day. Probably the best known, and a lot of that is because he had a distinguished career as a lawyer and jurist. He's a William Mary law professor. Funny story about that, after the war, and we'll talk about wartime stuff in a second, he liked to teach his law classes out of his house. And if you've ever been to Williamsburg, there is the St. George Tucker House, and it's now used as a special events venue for CW. And that's where he taught his classes, because that's where his books were. And so, yeah, look at my fellow professor, John, here, to commiserate. After a few semesters of this, the college kind of started to send, well, it wasn't emailed back then, but kind of whatever equivalent they had, to Professor Tucker to say, do you think you could teach at the actual college? Because it's a little awkward. You got these kids running all the way around Williamsburg to your house to teach classes. But he said, well, my books are at my house. And this would kind of go back and forth through other semesters. And finally, he just quit teaching because he did not feel like going to the main campus to teach classes. And he just wanted his books in his house, and that's how he did things. And he just went into being a judge. So during the Revolution, he was another example of what I would describe as a very socially connected affluent individual that kind of found his way into an officer's commission. And it helped him that he also spoke fluent French, because he was able to serve as the chief interpreter for Thomas Nelson with the French High Command. So that got him in the driver's seat. He was in the front line, front row to see all the goings on during the siege. He also left, and I'll talk about this in a second, a really developed journal of day by day what he did during the siege. And that's one of the only primary source accounts we have left of what militia were doing during that time. So again, it's an invaluable resource. So those are just a few examples of people that I came up with in my research that show up in the book, these biographical profiles of people that, in a lot of cases, again, I'd never heard of before. And these are people that did interesting things, and they served nobly. And you know, to be sure, they were also products of their time. You know, they fought for freedom as they conceived it at that time. And, you know, we had to sort of work as time went on after that to form a more perfect union. But if you're interested in more books on this topic, this is a list of probably the better ones I've come across. So at the bottom there, like I said, St. George Tucker's Journal of the Siege. I only came across one academic journal article about this topic, Virginia Militia Commanders, or Virginia Militia at all, at Yorktown. And that was written by a guy named Bill Reynolds in 2015 for a magazine called Military Collector and Historian. So that's just sort of, it speaks to there's a void in this topic. We just don't know a lot about this. A couple of the better secondary sources, like me, Red War ancestors that are from New England, you know, the records were generally a lot better up there because, and that's a good side question. Why is there this lack of information about the Red War in this area, about people and that sort of thing? I'd say there kind of being two major reasons.
Illiteracy. Less people could write.
So part of it was, think about the siege of Yorktown, this stuff was happening fast and furious. They didn't have time to keep really good records in the first place, not to the same extent that would have been seen in the Continental Army or the French Army or the British Army. So there's just a lot of fast movement, there were units being shuffled around, they just weren't keeping very good records to begin with. Another reason, a lot of the records, as Darcy mentioned, were destroyed in the Civil War, what we had. And so again, it leaves this incomplete puzzle, and we have clues, you know, we can kind of make some progress, but it's going to take a lot more diligent research over time to come up with more of that picture. But other questions?
Can you repeat the questions? We can't hear what people are asking.
So the first question was, if you're trying to learn more about a Revolutionary War ancestor, like where do you go to get the information? And Mary had asked because her ancestor had served in the northern campaigns. But what I said was the fact that the ancestor was also from Virginia could mean that on that database, he still may have a pension application. And that's not to say that all of them do. Sometimes they didn't file one, but it would definitely still be worth checking it out. Sure.
So, great speech. Only in Gloucester, first black attorney was T.C. Walker, and his family is still living. Have you ever interviewed one of those family members? They're at the age to just talk to them as you write your book. And do you even know them?
Well, I certainly know of T.C. Walker, and my wife actually worked there when I was in elementary school for a number of years. Yeah. But that's a great suggestion, and yeah, that would be something I'd love to follow up on.
So most of the people from Gloucester, they are all members of Shalom Baptist Church.
Okay.
Shalom Baptist Church is between Roanoke Avenue and Chestnut Avenue. The young man that you should talk to, his name is Captain Harris, John Thomas Harris. He is the actual nephew of T.C. Walker.
Wow. Okay.
So he's living. And the doors of the church is open.
Excellent. That's a great suggestion.
And they are willing and able, I'm minded, to tell these stories that connect us back from Williamsburg,
Absolutely.
that type of thing. So,
Yeah, and that's a great point because it's not just what the soldiers and sailors doing, but what were the people who were supporting them doing? There was a larger ecosystem of people who lived in this area, and so yeah, that's something I'd definitely like to follow up on. Thank you.
Sean, do you have any gravestones or burial sites that can be connected to the Virginia militia during this week?
Yes, kind of really spread all over, to be honest with you, because when you look at the militia forces that were there, a lot of them were coming from central Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, and so there are a lot of grave sites out that way. There would have been some in this area, people who died in service and that kind of thing, but absolutely, yeah. I mean, but to the earlier point, some were damaged in the Civil War and that kind of thing as well, but there are some examples. Yeah. A lot of these people also, if you're looking up relatives, don't be surprised if they ended up in other states, because after the war they went where the land was, and so a lot of these people were heading out to Kentucky, they were heading out to Tennessee and Ohio. Is where my ancestors went from Massachusetts. So they didn't always remain in Virginia either, further west.
Off topic from today's discussion, but something I've seen, something in your work at one point about our famous crook of folk here, Hellcat Billy Jones. We all have been operating under the, I don't know where we got it from, that he died in office. But he said he was kicked out prior to that. In one of your works, didn't you? I thought I saw it.
I have to go back and look. I don't know if I remember the name. Billy Jones, huh?
I thought he died in office in 1878 as a clerk.
Okay.
Here, after the Civil War, he came
Yeah.
back and figured out the land.
Yeah.
Something in your writings I had seen.
It might be in that book I did about Mary Stuart Smith. I'll go back and look and follow up on that with you.
No big deal, but we always assumed he died in office.
Right,
It
right.
sounded like he was kicked out of office.
Okay. You never could happen.
Nice to
Yeah.
know that.
Right, exactly. Right.
Thanks, sir.
Right.
You mentioned Lafayette. Where was he during the Battle of Yorktown?
So, I believe he was with he gone back to France then? He made a trip to France and then came back in 1781, I think. I'm trying to remember if he was actually at Yorktown itself.
This is the debate. I've heard
Yeah.
different stories.
Yeah.
The closest thing I found to read was he was up on the hill. And I thought one Frenchman said he wasn't there. But the Americans are telling me he was there. So I think he was there for the surrender, but where was he for the battle? Was he
Yeah.
off?
That's one of those
Protected
things.
area? Was he in Williamsburg? I don't know.
I think, he's in that classification of people where they're Yorktown affiliated, but we can't really prove where they were. And so, like I said, in my work, I was trying to pinpoint, I could prove they were there during the dates of the siege itself. They were on site because veterans were saying, I surrendered that guy. But there was a lot of coming and going, and I know that in later stages of the war, Lafayette was also active trying to shore up French support, and so he may have been one of those coming and going types that was sort of there, but maybe he was there to surrender, but he wasn't there earlier in the siege. I'll have to follow up on that. Good question.
Trivia.
Yeah, right.
So we're looking for our women that were patriots that served. In all of your research, did you find any key characters that wives or somebody that contributed to the cause?
So, a couple things about that. There's a lot of really fascinating stories. If you're looking at the Yorktown campaign, what was happening in Virginia, of families that were displaced and they had to move further west. They were moving to the Richmond area, and so there were a lot of daughters and wives that would write accounts of just their lives being disrupted because they had to shift to go to safer ground, and so they had their own stories of sacrifice and serving the cause in their way of supporting, whether it's their husband, their brothers, or fathers, or doing things to provide material support to the cause. My favorite Rev War lady in this part of the world is Sally Carey Fairfax.
Yeah.
And nothing to do with Yorktown, But one thing I didn't realize was, anyone know who that is?
Yeah. George Washington's
Love interest. She's from Newport News.
Yeah, Fairstreet House.
Yep. Yep, exactly. So she was, like Darcy's saying, kind of the first love of George Washington that he never got over, and she had married into the Fairfax family. So the Carey family is the one with the local connection. They're Warwick County, and this is part of the world through and through. But she married the prominent Fairfax County and her family, and they, by the early 1770s, fled to England, because they actually were neighbors of the Washingtons at Mount Vernon. They lived pretty close to them, and they were tight. They were very, very close, all friendly. And Sally kind of fell in hard times in England. Her husband passed away, and she never came back to America. But even in his later years, General Washington would still write her letters, and so there was a friendship there. But it blew me away that she's Newport News. Yeah, so Sealy's on the James. I mean, so nice little connection.
There were stories of Washington driving up the old stagecoach road here to go visit Sally.
There you go. Yeah. So I think that's a story. The Sally Fairfax. That's a story that needs to be told more. I think that's So look like playing that sandbox.
And Captain Smith, perfect.
Right, yeah, right. Any other questions? All right, sure.
Did you do any research on the gunboats at Yorktown?
Tangentially, yeah. I mean, I kind of read about them a little bit, and my focus was predominantly on the Army side, but there definitely was naval activity as well. Yeah, but that would be kind of like a follow-up, to this research to dig a little bit more into that.
Okay.
Sean, real quick, what do we know about the 1824 visitors? Lafayette to Yorktown?
So, Lafayette came back on his victory tour, so to speak. And the funny thing with that was, if you imagine the America of the early 1820s, the revolutionary generation is dying off. And Lafayette is really one of the last connections in real time to that era, to the country's founding era, to George Washington. And so, and by then Lafayette, by our standards, wasn't even really that old, he was just in the 60s, but because he was so young during the Revolution. But he came over on what was supposed to be something like a 6-month visit, and ended up being 3 years, because the guy, he was living the life. I mean, he was getting the VIP treatment in town after town and being feted at all these events, and he loved it. So he went all over the place, and he did have a visit at Yorktown. Like I said, William Lewis was there to greet him along with other dignitaries. Along with the Yorktown visit, another famous episode was in Richmond when he visited there, and he ran into what historians usually call James Armistead Lafayette. And James Lafayette was a prominent African-American spy during the Revolution, and he was working for the Marquis, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, I don't know if we could have won the war without this guy, because what he did was he was able to work his way into the British High Command structure, and as basically kind of under guise as a servant, and just listening. And he was listening to these British generals talk and strategize, and then James would report back to the Marquis de Lafayette, and absolutely critical intel. I mean, that's one reason why we had an advantage at Yorktown, because we knew what the British were doing. And so there's this moment in 1824 where Lafayette visits Richmond, and among these huge crowds, he sees an elderly James Lafayette who had taken his name after the war. Yeah, and the Marquis stops his carriage, and he gets out, and they embrace, and they're just weeping. I mean, because they were that tight, and that's documented that happened. But again, James Armistead Lafayette, New Kent County, and another local hero that we just need to know more about. There's just all these incredible stories, Sally Fairfax, so a lot for us Rev War historians to do moving forward. Sure.
Now, I have early, excuse me, I can't think of the word I'm trying to say, any documents that prove it, but if you go by what's online, we had a Warren County colonel who was that left at Yorktown, Colonel Langhorne, William
Major.
Langhorne.
Oh, man, that guy's interesting. William Langborn, is that who you're talking about?
Right.
Yeah, so this is a guy who he kind of also has roots in New Kent, Charles City, King William, that area. If we're talking about the same person, but the William Langborn I'm familiar with. And he was an aide to the Marquis de Lafayette. And was brevetted a lieutenant colonel and came from an affluent family. And I'll stop running my mouth soon, Darcy. I'm having too much fun telling stories. So Langborn, following the revolution, I guess he had proposed to his love interest, and she said no or something like that. And then, all dejected, he basically packed up and went to Europe. And he walked around Europe for years. And I'm not just talking about London and downtown, I'm talking about he went the entire continent. He was in Russia, he was in north of the Arctic Circle in Norway, he was in Spain, he was in Italy, and just walked. And there's documentation at the time of Lafayette writing letters to George Washington, and they're talking about, hey, do you hear about that crazy Langborn guy, like what he's up to, and isn't he a weirdo? They're talking about him, and he knew everybody. I mean, he knew John Adams. There's a meal he had with John Abigail Adams in London, and again, another kind of relatively local person that we just don't know a lot about, know more about. So there's that kind of gets back to the spirit of this book, that I want to try to capture the stories of some of these people and kind of bring it back to life.
One of our members just went in the SAR under
Oh, wow, okay. So look into that. All right.
Dr. Heuvel, appreciate you coming out.
All right.
We really enjoyed it. Very informative.
My pleasure. If you're interested, I've got some books for sale. Happy to chat and sign books and keep the conversation going. But thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.
If anyone would like to purchase a book, it's $20. And before we go, we're going to have a raffle. So I'll just tell you quickly what the prizes are.